You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. However, he is also going to be joined by senior economist with the International Grains Program, Guy Allen, as the USDA's World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates came out recently on July 12th, and they're going to have a conversation about that. Dan, Guy, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
And so, kind of getting started with our usual here today, Dan, what are futures looking like?
Well, volatile. The day of the report on Wednesday, the 12th, we had a sharp drop off in corn, soybean, and impact also on wheat futures. We'll talk about wheat later, but we did see a recovery yesterday of at least part of that drop, with September corn closing at 493 D's at that kind of its benchmark anymore, $5, basically $5 and a half cent, and being up about 15-16 cents. So a lot of volatility. And that generally that sharp downward response was to the USDA's numbers that showed basically ending stocks still being above 2 billion bushels, an estimate of about 2.26 billion, about 2.3, stocks to use 15-16%. So the market interpreted those numbers as very, very bearish, and then dropped off, recovered some. For soybeans, that you've got a situation, we'll talk about why it had done that, but we saw the kind of the opposite, where more of an optimistic view of where the markets could go. We saw for soybean futures, we had dropped off also, or a lot of volatility, pardon me, at about 1440 thereabouts, closed actually up on the August contract, up 40 cents, up to 14.84 3/4. We're in these lofty price areas, aren't even worried about this. It doesn't surprise us anymore. This is where we quote spend our time anymore in the markets. So just a great amount of volatility. You see in the information that we put out on Ag Manager and on your website, volatility indices for both corn and soybeans, and strong upward moves for both of them. Really, it's kind of a question now as we sit on this precipice of mid-July where we go from here, and we'll talk about that later.
And I mentioned that the WASDE report recently came out, and we're kind of going to weave that into our conversation as we talk about our domestic grain market also. And so, starting with the commodity of corn, what do we see and how did that report impact it?
Well, this report took the acreage numbers from that the June 30th, end of June's acreage report, plugged in the corn number of 94.096 million acres planted, up from 92 million, and you did see the USDA drop their estimate of the corn yield from 181.5 trend line yield from early on this year down to 177.5, and basically ended up at just about the same place, at just about 15.3 billion bushels. Really no other changes on the usage side for the supply demand balance sheet to speak of. Ending stocks still about the same place, about 2.57, 2.62 billion bushels. The price did not change, etc. I would say, while we're talking corn, the grain sorghum is just a close cousin, still a feed grain, pretty important for us out here in the Western Plains. And you did see also a jump up in the grain sorghum acreage from 5.97 before that report up to about 6.8, production from 360 million projected now up to 411, and ending stocks at about just up a little bit. What's kind of working behind the scenes that's surprising to me is really pretty strong forward purchases for grain sorghum, surprisingly so, Guy, on that crop. We pay a lot of attention to corn, and generally we're just so in terms of our pace there. But the grain sorghum numbers, you've got forward sales of 104% of the USDA's projection. And I would say, just to add in on the international side, not much change really in ending stocks. A projection for ending stocks to jump higher in the next mark at the end of 23-24. It starts September 1st. Guy, any international comments you'd have on the corn market?
No, just reflecting back on futures. We're back for December corn's the lowest level since it's been since November of 2021, which is, I just don't understand why we're dropping to such low levels, as you said, giving the tightness both domestically here in the U.S. and globally. The international news that we're seeing has been quite bearish in a lot of ways, particularly with the big crops coming out of Brazil and that second corn crop and the slowness in the export pace. But yeah, it's just things are very, very tight underlying both domestically and internationally, and it's not going to take much of a change of the wind to, I think, rally these prices back from these current low levels on that.
Guy, have you heard? I remember earlier on this year that when the second corn crop, the safrinha corn crop, was planted in Brazil, that it was planted about a month late. And you look at the weather maps down there, and they're dry in those areas. So, but we have enough enthusiasm and enough projections that everything will be fine. That we haven't heard that, but I guess I haven't heard of any impact of that. But I would still be watchful the next incoming weeks as to the possibility of dry weather catching some of that crop and trimming it down some late. But it's just my own thought.
Yeah, well, just today, CONAB came out with a Brazilian crop estimate of for corn of 127 million tons, including their three crop harvests. That exceeds the total grown last year by 14.6 million metric tons. That's nearly a 13% increase in the crop. And it's been moving to market as rapidly as they can get it moved that way. So that's really weighing on that market.
Yeah, those are the numbers the market's bidding off of at this time.
Yeah.
And as we've talked about corn now, Dan, you mentioned sorghum. So what are we seeing there?
A big thing on sorghum is again that acreage increase, and sorghum right now, that the part of the country we grow that in has a lot of moisture, and unless we get too cool of weather, there's some issue that slows that crop down. And it got into the fall, it seems like we're poised to have a lot of sorghum bushels come into play, and exports, etc., seem to be holding up surprisingly well at this time. So interesting to watch and see where all that goes.
Guy, have you seen anything on the international side for grain sorghum?
Nothing new on the sorghum market. The sorghum and the corn markets have been internationally been fairly quiet, with not necessarily a lot of new news happening there. We do continue to keep one eye on the Ukraine, but we'll talk about that when we get to wheat. And the Chinese demand's been steady, but nothing exciting there on the sorghum side of things. And it's that Chinese demand which in the past few years has either put a big premium in that sorghum relative to corn, or when it sort of fades away, sorghum settles down to corn price or just under.
And we've talked about corn now, we've talked about grain sorghum, and one more commodity we want to talk about on our first segment here of Agriculture Today is soybeans.
Yes, the driver on soybeans is, again, we're I guess we're pivoting off of that acreage report where the USDA dropped the planted acreage in the United States by 4 million acres from 87.5 down to 83.505, and the USDA kept the same yield of 52 million acres, but the net of that's that we dropped from about 4.5 billion bushels down to 4.3, saw the reverberations coming through the supply-demand balance sheet. The USDA did, I guess, in response to what they see as needed rationing that'll happen with just less supplies. The crush number was down a little bit, about 10 million down to 2.3 billion. The export number, given the anticipation of all that's coming out of Brazil in particular, down 125 million bushels. Ending stocks at the end of all that, down 50 million, down to 300 million bushels. The USDA did give a feint towards anticipation of stronger markets, raised the season average price projection from $12.10 a bushel up to $12.40. Guy, any comments that you'd have on the international aspects of the soybean market, especially with what you anticipate coming out of China and other customers?
Well, looking at the supply side first, Brazil, USDA put Brazil for 22-23 at 156 million metric tons. For this coming year, it's at a new record of 163 million metric tons. Looking at Argentina for this past year, they had that at 25 million metric tons, but they're increasing that on more optimistic weather up to 48 million metric tons. So that's going to be fairly significant increase in that South American production on that. Looking at the demand side, they really didn't change China too much. Imports were just up slightly, only 350,000 tons. China was up 1 million to 99. I actually think that's a bit optimistic, but that would put them back up to more levels that we've seen the last few years. Other imports have been reduced by 3.25 million metric tons to 166, mostly across Southeast Asia. And I think that's a reflection of sort of the higher prices that we've seen and just some decline in demand. Also, the big unknown on that is the impact of African swine fever, which continues to raise its head up fairly frequently. China specifically, its crush is expected to be fairly steady at 95 million metric tons for 23-24 going forward. That's up 4 million metric tons from the 91 million metric tons they have plugged in for 22-23. So no real surprises on that, but it does tend to be a bit supportive from China's situation. But as we've seen, China seems to have a real preference for buying from Brazil rather than the U.S. at the moment. And look, that's a pricing situation.
If I just add in real quickly that as we move away from La Nina into El Nino, generally, if I understand those weather patterns, what we anticipate to be dry moves north in South America. So Argentina, southern Brazil, the dry conditions this year, as that we get full-blown impact of La Nina, I think we'd see areas like Mato Grosso. Some of those areas, stronger areas to the north, would be at more risk for dryness. So what we anticipate for next year for South America has yet to be planted. That'll be planted October, November, December. So it's all betting on the come, I guess.
Yeah, and I'd suggest I don't think the USDA has adjusted those numbers for an El Nino, La Nina weather situation. I think they tend to use a trend line number there, and I think that 163 million is pretty optimistic.
And so this is a recent report, a lot of this information from a recent USDA report, the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates that just came out July 12th. We're cutting to a short break now, but when we return, we're going to be joined once again by Guy Allen and Dan O'Brien, and we're going to continue this conversation and talk a little bit about wheat, but also the dollar index and some international freight market information. So we're going to international freight market information.